Welcome to Take 5. I'm Nick Park and I'm taking us through a series of 5-minute messages where we look at Jesus revealed in every book of the Old Testament. It's based on a book that I wrote about 9 years ago called 40 Days with Jesus in the Old Testament, where there was an introduction, then it looked at each of the 39 books in the Old Testament. But this is taking us, in these Take 5s, a lot more than 40 days because you know what? Jesus is all over the Old Testament, and we're only scratching the surface of the revelation of Jesus that is there. But we're going through the books of the Old Testament, and now we've arrived at the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes is one that can actually be quite depressing to read, and I've known some people read it and say, I don't quite understand this. What's it doing in the Bible? Well, it says at the beginning, it's written by the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And that's almost certainly King Solomon. And, you know, a lot of scholars would think that Solomon, this is not at the beginning of his reign, but this is afterwards when Solomon, despite his wisdom, had ended up in all kinds of nonsense with the different women that he gathered as wives, and he'd allowed paganism. And to be honest, his kingship did not end as well as it started. But we do believe that Solomon came back to a point of repentance and began to re-examine his life. And that Ecclesiastes, that's the reason why it's a little bit depressing, because Solomon is celebrating who God is, but he's still looking back in sadness at how better things could have been, even with his wisdom. In chapter 1, verse 8 of Ecclesiastes, he says, "For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief." And certainly there are people who look at life that way. They see life as sort of going around in circles and not being that meaningful. Whereas, and I do believe that Solomon probably fell into that state of affairs. But we know that God has a purpose, and God is working to a plan and a purpose. And God has a purpose for our lives that is for good, not for evil. Thank God that we aren't limited to what Solomon saw, because we have the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, Ecclesiastes is similar to the book of Job in that it asks questions. And you're left feeling unsatisfied because you don't get really satisfying answers to those questions in Ecclesiastes, because it's asking questions that only Jesus can answer. And this is why the Old Testament on its own as a standalone is not complete. It's going to leave you puzzled, it's going to leave you waiting, and it's going to leave you frustrated, because the Old Testament is completed by the New Testament and the revelation of Jesus there. Now, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 to 8, you have some words that I've often heard them read at funerals, and sometimes I'm frustrated at the way they're used at funerals. It's Ecclesiastes 3, 1 to 8, where it speaks about there being a time for everything, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to rejoice, a time to sorrow, a time to love, a time to hate. And sometimes I hear this read at funerals, but it's only half the story, and it's just left hanging there at a sort of point, well, yeah, life's a bit meaningless, isn't it? You know, there's a bit of everything, but what's the point of it all? But you see, it doesn't go through to the end, to what it says at the end. Because after that, after setting it up that life is a time for this, a time for that, a time for the other, it then says in verse 11 of Ecclesiastes chapter 3, "But God has set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end." And of course they can't. So God's put these questions, you know, these questions that the guy's asking in Ecclesiastes, they're not bad questions. They're questions that God has put there. God puts these questions in the human heart to prepare us for Jesus. But we can't see. It says we can't fathom what God has done from beginning to end, because God sees the end from the beginning and we do not. And the end is Jesus Christ. So you can only really understand these questions in Ecclesiastes when you understand that Jesus is the answer to them. And that phrase, God has set eternity in the hearts of men, this is something that anthropologists and missionaries have discovered around the world, that they travel around the world and they find these legends and they find these beliefs among all societies and primitive tribes and everything else. But they are these beliefs that are just there, and it's like they prepare the way and they prepare a bridge for when the gospel is preached to them, that people say, hang on, this is the fulfillment of what our culture has always believed through this legend or this belief or this story. God has set eternity in the hearts of men. God did not just send Jesus as an afterthought. God put everything in place. He even, in different cultures, including among the Jews, Ecclesiastes, put the right questions into our hearts, that we would be asking the questions that only Jesus can answer. Because Jesus is the answer to the questions of the questions in the book of Ecclesiastes. God bless you today. Join us again tomorrow for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.